This building behind me is a plantation. This was an actual plantation house. I'm about a mile from where the main part of the Battle of Franklin happened. But battles, I mean, they don't just, stick in that little tiny area. They were spread out, through several miles of this area. And the area around this plantation, there was some pretty heavy fighting. It was home to a husband and wife, last name Mcgavock. Mcgavock. They were Confederates through and through. They owned dozens of slaves. They had several hundred acres of plantation land. And behind me over here, they have a 1 acre, just a garden. So these were wealthy people. They were landowners. They were slave owners. These people were Confederates through and through. And they woke up the morning after the battle to find dead and dying soldiers stacked up in their yard from left over from the battle. And the lady, I forget her first name, but the wife, husband died relatively soon after the war, like 1867 or 1868. The wife lived till 1905, and she lived in this house all the way up till then. And she started a Confederate cemetery with all the bodies laying around her yard. And we're going to look at it here in a minute. The cemetery is still here. It's a Confederate cemetery. And there's also, it started out as a family plot, so there's several slaves buried in there. And the contradiction of having slaves and Confederate soldiers who fought to keep them slaves in the same cemetery is kind of odd. They do give tours of the house, but I got here about 2 minutes too late to get the last ticket on a tour. So I'm not going to go inside. I'm going to have to come back here to this area and get tours of these places that I was just a little too late to get a tour into. But we're going to take a walk around here so you can see the grounds of this plantation house, and then we're going to take a walk down and find the cemetery. I think the cemetery is that way somewhere. So this is part of the garden that this family had. This is the house, and it's a relatively, I think from what I've been able to tell, a relatively typical southern plantation house. Like I said, you can take tours. The tour just started. The people in front of me in line bought the last 2 tickets for the last tour of the day. So, oh well, what you gonna do? But this is the garden, and it's just a basic, it's got some crops, but it's also got some flowers, and it's just a nice place to hang out. I believe there is an area here in the middle to sit and enjoy the ambiance. But that's the tour right there on the front of the house. I didn't get a ticket for that tour, but here, this is the garden. It's a pretty garden. So we'll take a walk up. Yeah, they're going in the house, so when they go in the house, I'll be able to go up on the porch and not bother anybody. That's the tour I missed by 2 minutes. It's an hour and a half tour. I probably wouldn't have had time to take the tour anyway. But this is the front porch of the plantation house. And there's a couple of outbuildings down here we'll go and take a look at. They have a thing here where you can buy a tour of the house, or you can just spend a little less money and buy a walking grounds pass just to walk around the grounds, which is what I bought since I wasn't going to be able to take the tour. They apparently don't want you walking in this area. Looks like maybe they're doing either some restoration work or they're doing some rehab work. These look like foundations. I wonder if this was part of the house originally that they just recently dug up. Oh, hello, bird. What is this? Okay, so they had a building like this at the other place I was just at, and I don't know if... I'm sure the tour would have told me what this building is. I don't know. Had this same canoe-looking thing. I don't know what it is. Probably a shitter, and I'm just pointing at the toilet. So let's see here. There's a couple of signs. We'll go to this house first. There's a sign in the ground here. What's this say? Oh, no, it's not a sign. It's a manhole cover. Never mind. I'm probably walking over the septic tank. I'm not entirely sure where the Confederate cemetery is. I'm hoping it'll be well marked and I'll be able to find it relatively easy. I've got a map. I guess I could look at the map. Oh, what is this? I'm sure that some of these buildings will be slave cabins. Actually, looks like maybe this is a slave cabin. 11 slaves. 1860, there were 44 slaves, and they said inside that they owned a couple different properties. Looks like they had a couple slaves escape and go serve in the Union Army. That was one of the things when the Union Army would come through an area like this where half of the people who lived in this county were slaves. Like 52% of the people who lived in this county were slaves. When the Union Army would come through, they would liberate all the slaves they found. And a lot of times the slaves would try to join the army. You know, the newly freed slaves would try to join the army, and they didn't have any guns, and they didn't have any training, and they'd never been soldiers, and they didn't really help the army. And so the army would kind of try to slough them off and, you know, put them off some ways, you know, without having them, you know, come bog the army down. There's some horrible stories about Union soldiers and Union armies, like, abandoning slaves to advancing Confederate forces because they just didn't have the time and the energy to deal with them and fight the war at the same time. But a lot of the slaves in this area were not, that didn't happen to when they came through here, this area. The slaves were basically just sent north, and they became laborers. They drove wagon loads of supplies for the army. And a lot of them moved north and stayed north. Well, this is a, what is this? I think this is nothing. I think this looks like it might be a storeroom. So there's a sign up here. Let's see if I can find, if one of these signs is going to point me to the cemetery. I assume that the cemetery, there's the Plantation House. I'm assuming the cemetery will be someplace close to the plantation because they said inside that the lady who lived in the house maintained the cemetery all the way up until her death. So my assumption is that Spring House, that's this building here. So there's a natural spring. Okay, so there's a river down here, and this thing is used, this house was used to store water out of the river. That makes sense. So that doesn't tell me where the cemetery is, though. I may have to break down and get my map out and use my map to find the cemetery. That's not the map I want. Because it isn't being obvious. That's the brochure, Carnton. Carnton is the name of the plantation. Carnton Plantation, owned by the Mcgavock family? Mcgavock. This is just talking about how many acres. It had 450 acres. And 45, well, this says 28, 1850, 28 slaves. I think they said 44 in 1860. So it still wasn't one of the major plantations. There were plantations that had hundreds of slaves. And in this, like I said, in this county, 52% of the population was slaves. Let's see, here's a map. Let's see if I can find the cemetery on the map. So, let's see here. There's the garden. So I guess I should have gone out the garden to find the cemetery. Oh, all right, let's walk over to the garden. I did not see anything that looked like a cemetery over by the garden, but I suppose I could have missed it. I read inside that 1,800 people are buried in the cemetery, so it's not a small thing. And the lady in the desk who sold me the grounds pass told me to make sure I saw the cemetery. So I know it's something that you can see, something you can find. Sorry for the camera bouncing. I'm walking on a gravel road. Not a very even terrain. I should probably get out that gimbal I bought. It'll probably make this look a lot less jerky. I assume this is all still owned by the state. It's a state historic site, Tennessee State Historic Site. I assume that the grounds are still owned by the state. I don't know how many acres are left. Usually when you get these 400-acre farms, The state only owns a small fraction. The Jesse James farm where I was at a couple of weeks ago was originally 250 acres, and the state owned like 25 of them. The rest of it had been sold off for various things over the course of the years. All right, so that's the garden. Let's see if I can find the cemetery. Oh, is that the cemetery all the way over there? Yeah, it might be. That's a hike. That's got to be it, though, doesn't it? That's a long walk for an old lady in 19... Oh, wait a minute. Is this it over here? Maybe this is it over here. It's not as long a walk for an old lady in 1905. Yeah, that's it there. Okay, that's not... I thought it was way the hell over there. But it's right over here. So that's not as bad as I thought. So that's the top of the plantation house is right there. And this is the cemetery over here. I'm going to cut across the grass. I wonder if they use this for something other than just open field. I wonder if they have you can have weddings or something here on this field, or they have concerts or something. Otherwise, it seems like kind of a waste of a big piece of open land. Yeah, this is the cemetery over here. Okay. One of the owners' children of the house I was at a few minutes ago, the Carter house, died in the Battle of Franklin. I wonder if he's buried here. I know they said he was buried in the area. I think most of these graves are of people who were found dead on the property of the Mcgavock family. You wake up in the morning after a battle and there's 2,000 dead bodies on your property. What do you do? I mean, back then there was no coroner to call. I imagine she just probably had her slaves digging graves for 6 months afterwards. So the Mcgavock family cemetery, it says. So let's see here. Numerous family members. John Mcgavock was... Yeah, so this is a family... Okay, I see what they did. So this is a family cemetery here. There's another set of fencing over there, and I bet you that's where they buried all the Confederate dead. So let's take a look in here and see what's in here. Yeah, okay, this is definitely an old cemetery. Let's see some of the dates on these. Yeah, I can't read that. John Rogers, born 1747, died 1836. And he's inside of here. It's a weird thing about some of these older cemeteries. They didn't bury him. He's inside that box. Mcgavock. Okay, this is the lady, Carrie Mcgavock, 1829 to 1905. She's the one who was instrumental in maintaining this cemetery after the war. And that's her husband, John Mcgavock, 1815 to 1893. So he did live quite a bit longer than I thought. This one died 1862. I'm looking for Carter is the guy's name who died in the battle and was buried. I think he was buried in this cemetery, but he might be over there. That's the Confederate cemetery over there. This is the family plot. And most of these stones are worn down so bad I can't begin to read what they say. 1863 to 1907, 1855 to 1934. This one just says, "My child." Willie Harding. And this doesn't look big enough to be an adult's. That one neither. Doesn't look big enough to be an adult. Those are probably children. Let's look over here. And usually in cemeteries like this, even though there's no stones in this area, there's probably graves. So many of these older, especially the old ones, they don't have gravestones or never did have gravestones. I'm sure somebody is buried here. They actually have a cross carved on it, but there's no stone. Okay, here we are. Known to God, here rest the mortal remains of men, women, and children of Africa, enslaved in life, freed in death. So this is probably some sort of a mass grave, or maybe this area is a bunch of unmarked graves of slaves. Probably slaves of the Mcgavock family. Let's see. Yeah, in this part of the family cemetery are buried some of the people who were once enslaved here, former slaves, perhaps African Americans who labored at Carnton in the decades after the Civil War. Not slaves anymore, but sharecroppers and day laborers and stuff. Only marked graves in the African American sections are of Mariah and Bolin Reddick's twin sons, stillborn in 1877, so that was after the war. She had been a slave, and she was buried in downtown Franklin, but her stillborn kids are buried here. Now, I don't. All right, so it's talking about, how them burying slaves. Slave cemeteries typically lacked headboards. Simple field stones marked the graves. So this is I wonder if that's no, because they said only 2 of them were marked. So I think this area here must be where the slaves are buried. And I don't know. Let's see if I can figure out. Wonder if it's these 2 here. Let's see. That one's not legible. 1877. That's probably it. This is probably the grave of the stillborn kids. So this is all the slave graves, and they don't have names on them. They're just slabs of wood or slabs of stone. They don't look like any of them are written on. So this is a bunch of slave graves. And then this is a cemetery of the Confederate dead from the Battle of Franklin, which was in 1864, late November 30th, I think they said. So they had, looks like they buried them on the battlefield. Usually when guys were killed in action in the Civil War, they often buried them where they fell. It was kind of the way they did it. And this guy looks like this Colonel John Mcgavock, whose grave is over there. He didn't like the way the Confederate graves looked on the battlefield, so he set this up. And it says they're ordered by state. Oh, I see. So, wonder how they knew. 89 killed at Franklin from Texas. 89 killed at Franklin, and that says Texas. Over here is Tennessee, 230 killed. Do they have names on them? I bet not. They have initials, Major, TLM, ADF. They have numbers on them, so maybe somewhere they have like a key as to who's in what plot. But during a war like the Civil War, and especially at the end of it, like the Battle of Franklin, when things were kind of falling apart logistics-wise and supply-wise and resource-wise, they probably are like, oh, here's a dead body. Well, dig a hole and throw it in. And they buried it right there where it fell. And then, a few years later, they moved it. But did they have the guy's name? Did they know who he was? Did they know where he's from? Did his family have any idea what happened to him? Or did he just go off to war and never came home? Most of the time, I think he just went off to war and never came home. But the Civil War was the birth of the modern funeral industry. Was the first time they really embalmed bodies, because some guys did try to have their remains sent home. And then there was the first time that there were embalmers on the battlefield. So there would be funeral homes that would send, guys out to the battlefield, and they would embalm bodies. If a family asked them to embalm this body so we can have it shipped home, they would do that. They would embalm the body, preserve the body, and they would send it home. A lot of times they would send out, if you had a funeral home in the area and there was a battle in the area, you would send out your cart to the battlefield, and you would pick up any body that was an officer. Like if this guy's a captain, this guy's a major, this guy's a sergeant. Anybody who was an officer, and you would pick him up and you would bring him back, and even if you didn't know who he was, you would try and find out, because then you could tell his family, look, your loved one is dead, but I have his body. Would you like to pay me to send it home? And invariably, an officer's family is going to have the money to do that, whereas an enlisted man's family probably wouldn't be able to afford it. So that was how kind of the modern funeral industry started, was during the Civil War, when families were trying to get the body sent back home. But obviously none of these guys here got sent back home. They're all laying here relatively close to where they died. And it would be interesting to know how many of these guys who are buried here, how many of their families knew that they were buried here, knew that, one, they were killed in the Battle of Franklin, and two, they were buried on the battlefield, and three, that they were eventually moved from the battlefield to this cemetery. Or did their son, husband, brother, whatever, go off to war, wrote, and then just never wrote. And actually, a couple of these I'm looking at here, this one died in 1902. So I wonder if this was a veteran of the Battle of Franklin who wanted to be buried next to his compatriots. 1918, 1902, 1904. So this row here might be people who survived the battle, but wanted to be buried like those guys on the guys who survived the sinking of the USS Arizona. And when they died, they asked their ashes to be put back in the boat. That might be what happened there. But it is all laid out by state. He's got, what's this? This is Kansas, 104 killed. This is Alabama, 129 killed. I'm kind of curious as to how he knows what state they're from. Usually after a battle, they say, okay, this guy's wearing this dead guy's wearing a uniform of, Alabama. They will bury him in the Alabama mass grave, or they'll bury him and, say on his gravestone, Alabama. But like I said, a lot of times they didn't know their names. The Civil War was also the first time that soldiers started carrying identification on them, so that if they were killed, someone would know who they were, dog tags or some other form of identification. But a lot of times in the aftermath of a battle, no one had time for that. Their bodies were laying there and they were getting nasty and they were getting putrid. Mississippi, 424 killed. They were getting putrid and they were getting nasty. And they had to get them in the ground. And they didn't really spend a lot of time. Here's one, unknown. They didn't spend a lot of time finding out who they were. Unknown. I wonder if maybe the initials are on there because that was what was on their original wooden gravestones on the battlefield. Someone just carved their initials into the wood. Georgia, 63 killed. But like I said, the Civil War was the first time when soldiers really started to carry identification, so they could be identified after they died. Before the Civil War, really almost all the time, your husband, your brother, your son, whoever it was, would go off to war and just would never come home. And you would assume, well, they're dead. Whether they died in battle or, which was much more likely, they died of disease. The Civil War was really the first war where they understood at least a little bit about how disease would take out entire regiments as opposed to battle. Before that, if you had 1,000 soldiers die, probably 700 of them died of disease in camp without ever seeing a gun. Because disease just ran through those camps and hygiene wasn't what it should have been, and they would end up snuffing it. But yeah, almost all of these have some sort of initials on them, and this one has he's a captain, and that one says unknown. So a lot of these they don't know who they were. Maybe they know the town, what state they were from. This one says Louisiana, 18 killed. So I think I read somewhere that there was 1,800 graves in this Confederate part of the cemetery. Several in a row, unknown. And the bigger stones, I suspect, are probably put up by families who found out that their loved one was here. And that one, I can't read it, but it does have a name on it. That knew their loved one was here, but did not, either couldn't afford it or didn't want to have them disinterred and brought home. Because by the time this cemetery was put in, the battle is 3 or 4 years in the past. At that point, is there really a point in disinterring the body and bringing it home just to bury it again. When you can just have, well, this is quite a monument here. Who's this guy? L.R. Fowles, Captain Company F, 1st Mississippi Regiment, killed at Franklin, November 30th, 1864, age 32 years. So I'm assuming that, like, this one's unknown, that one's unknown. I'm assuming that a family paid to put this up at some point. It looks pretty old, so probably it's not a recent invention. There's a sign over here. Let's see what the sign has to say about the cemetery. That's another decent-sized monument. What's this? I can't read that. Here lies... Yeah, I can't read that. Let's see, is this another state over here? Or these... Florida. Florida. Kentucky. So these are probably states where it didn't have a lot of people at the Battle of Franklin. Kentucky in particular was a slave-holding state, but they did not join the Confederacy. They tried to stay neutral. Here, that says Kentucky too. Maddox, that says. At least they had that one's last name. That says Florida too. Let's see what this says. Mcgavock Confederate Cemetery. Confederate soldiers were buried near the Carter House. That's where I was. With the graves arranged in plots. As the winter of the war, many of the headstones were faded or were used for firewood. So the guy who owned this plantation donated this land, and starting in 1866, they started moving graves. Each known name they put on the stone. It looks like the wife did it until 1905, and then they handed it over to a veterans group, and then in the Daughters of the Confederacy, and now there's trustees. Okay, so trustees of the corporation voted to authorize members of the Franklin chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy to serve. They do so to this date. They're not really daughters anymore. They're like great-great-great-granddaughters of the Confederacy, but okay. Yeah. So, that is the Mcgavock... Oop, I got my hand in front of the camera. That is the Mcgavock Confederate Cemetery. Almost exclusively casualties of the Battle of Franklin, which happened in Franklin, Tennessee, south of Nashville, in November of 1864. And if you think about it, I suppose there's a little bit of 20/20 hindsight, but even at the time, most everybody knew that the war was over, that the Confederacy had lost, the Union had won, and it was just a matter of figuring out how it was going to end. Everyone pretty much knew it was over at that point. So the 1,800 people lying in this cemetery, and however many more are buried on the battlefield, both Confederate and Union, and really anybody who died, I'd say any time after, say January 1st of 1864, maybe sometime in June or July, but by June and July of 1864, and definitely by November of 1864, everybody knew the war was over. It was just a matter of how it was going to end. So when you think about it in that respect, everyone in this cemetery, all these people around me, essentially died for nothing. Everybody who was killed in this battle, everybody who was killed in the Battle of Nashville 2 weeks after this, everybody who died during Sherman's March on the Sea, all those battles. It happened in late 1864, early 1865, Appomattox, all of those battles. All those people died for nothing. Didn't change a thing. The South was going to lose. I mean, looking back, you could say you knew the South was going to lose as soon as Gettysburg was over. As soon as Gettysburg was over, I mean, looking back now with 2020 hindsight, you can definitely say as soon as Gettysburg was over, South was done. And that was July of 1863. Even if you didn't think it was over at that point at the time, by the time this battle happened, everybody knew the war was over. All the way up to the top of both governments. Lincoln knew the war was over. Jefferson Davis knew the war was over. Robert E. Lee knew the war was over. Grant and Sherman knew the war. Everyone knew the war was over. Probably most of these guys knew the war was over. And they went out there and they died anyway. And it just is incredibly wasteful. And didn't have to happen. But anyway, that is the Confederate cemetery of the Battle of Franklin in Franklin, Tennessee. Hope you all have a good day.